Hello, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives and happy 2026, or should I say happy Militarized 2026. Well, Harley Schlanger's back and we're going to talk about it. So let's go. And welcome once again. I'm John O'Loughlin, and my guest here today, as we hope to do every 2 weeks going forward, is our good friend Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute. Harley, you must feel like a one-armed paper hanger after a long day. You guys must be busy as can be, scrambling to catch up with this Venezuela matter. So, tell me what's the latest that your organizations have found out, maybe some interviews with people or local contacts?
Well, we're working on it, but it's one of these things that's hard to pin down because you have so many different lines. But let me start with a bit of humor. There's a sign in a demonstration that took place in Manhattan today. It said, "Will ICE raid the New York Manhattan Southern District Courthouse and deport Maduro and his wife back to Venezuela? He is certainly not here legally."
Well, I think hell might freeze over before ICE takes that charge on.
Well, I mean, there's so many different scenarios and so many different cover stories. You have the pro-Trump crowd basically saying this was a brilliant police maneuver to carry out a drug warrant. But then they say it's the whole question of the Don Roe doctrine. They also say that this is the new era where the U.S. will not be stopped from doing what's in its interest without really defining what the U.S. interest is. You also have the whole question of how did this thing get pulled off with the Venezuelan military not firing a shot? Or if they fired some shots, we don't know much about it. How did this get worked out that the Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, 1 minute is threatened by Trump and the next minute welcomed by Trump as the new president? So there are a lot of things that we have to pick through and figure out what's actually going on. But what's clear is what you titled this segment. This is a new militarized world. The decision has been made that the United States is going to function as though it's the law of the jungle, not a international law. There's an interesting statement that Trump made when he said in his press conference 2 days ago, he said, "American dominance in the Western Hemisphere won't be questioned again." Now, who is questioning Western American dominance?
The BRICS.
Well, the BRICS, and this is where you see the attack on the international shift that's going on. I mean, there's a whole lot we have to sort through, John, because I can't tell you that it's this or that caused this thing. I will tell you that if you're looking for a bad guy, it's Marco Rubio. And here's another irony. Trump basically endeared himself to his base by saying he's going to take on the CIA as part of the deep state. Now, there are two examples in the last couple of days of him knuckling under to CIA mythology. The first one is where does Rubio come from? The Bay of Pigs veterans. His political career started as an ally of the anti-Castro Cubans, and he goes every single year to their reunion. These are the ones who tried to launch an overthrow of Castro, and when John Kennedy first came in, John Kennedy opposed them, but this is Rubio. Rubio is part of that network, and Trump is basically embracing that, at least in this hemisphere. Then secondly, you had this event of the drone attack on Putin's house. And Trump initially said he was angry to hear about it because this shouldn't happen. He's going to talk to Zelensky about it. And then John Ratcliffe, the CIA director, briefed Trump that this was made up, that there was no attack, no drone attack on Putin. Now, there he is, once again, relying on the discredited CIA that's trying to break the Trump relationship with Putin. And so you see in these two instances, the deep state getting their tentacles in. Now, I'll give you a third one. There's a strange guy named Hamish de Breton Gordon, who's a British retired colonel who's been involved in the chemical weapons business and so on. He wrote an op-ed in the Daily Telegraph 3 days before the invasion or the kidnapping of Maduro. And what he said in his article is that Putin is on the verge of being overthrown. Why? Because NATO now realizes that the Russian military is inferior to NATO, and NATO can do what it wants. Then he goes on to say that Trump will use Venezuela's oil to push the price of oil down, which will greatly destabilize Putin's economic policy. And there are a couple of other things of that sort in his column. But the final point, he said that you now have the upper hand in the administration from the people who are working with the coalition of the willing, that is Macron, Starmer, and Merz, that they used quiet and effective diplomacy to win Trump back to their side. So whether they intended or not, this guy let out the game plan, which is you can't force an agreement on Zelensky. You have to keep the wars going and extend it to the Western Hemisphere. And the final point I'll make in an opening is that this is very ominous when you talk about the militarization. It's ominous because the National Security Strategy paper defined that this would happen. The U.S. would now be more responsive to issues in the Western Hemisphere and less involved with NATO. Now, NATO reads that and says, well, we better get the U.S. more involved with us. But it's an ominous turn. I don't think it's going to hold up because most of the world is opposed to this. But meanwhile, there are all kinds of other things set in motion. I told you I was just on Pakistani TV to comment on a battle going on between Bangladesh and India over the water from the Ganges, Brahmaputra rivers, that the Indians are supposedly violating a treaty by taking more of the water than they're supposed to. The Bangladeshis are challenging that. And you could have a war between India and Bangladesh. That's one of many potential wars, confrontations in a polarized world. But the key is, it's not about India or Bangladesh. It's about breaking up the BRICS. That if you have India fighting Bangladesh, it breaks any potential for that part of Asia to have an alliance that threatens the empire. So it's the Wild West out there, or the law of the jungle, as Helga Zeppler-Roush is calling it. And we've got to appeal to statecraft to untangle these issues and recognize that there are common interests that are being violated here.
Yeah, it's frightening. Let me float by you an idea that was the first thing that hit me when this hit the news the other morning. I think, well, I submit the idea that when Saudi Arabia has announced that it's going to stop restricting oil sales to the US dollar as of January 2026, and they did that over a year ago. That was a clock ticking on the US dollar, and that the US government's hand was forced in order to support the dollar to have a visible source of oil that if they can, grab, what is everybody says is the biggest reserve of oil in the world, then they can control the price of oil and make sure the dollar stays as the dominant currency in the world. So that was my thought was, if the dollar, what was just allowed to float against all the other currencies right now, I think it would go down very far. What's your reaction to that idea?
Well, the Saudi question is one of the issues you have to address in trying to figure out what the strategy is all about. Because the U.S. was caught off guard when the Saudis and the Iranians signed a treaty agreement brokered by the Chinese. And this is Mohammed bin Salman, who's looking for something he can play off against the United States. So he's not dependent only on the U.S. And that's what you're talking about in terms of the dollar, but also in terms of diplomacy. The rivalry in Southwest Asia has been the Zionists against everyone else, but then the Shia versus Sunni, using the Saudis to counter Iran. Now, what happened when the Iranians and the Saudis made an agreement? And part of that agreement was to use the yuan in oil trades. So that gets to the point you were making. But I don't think that's the predominant factor. I think it's the Saudis asserting themselves and saying to Trump, don't take for granted that you can hold out normalization of relations with Israel, between Saudi Arabia and Israel, as something that the Saudis really want. The Saudis don't want to have a war with Israel. And of course, Netanyahu's prepared to fight everyone. So that's part of what's going on there. But the oil question, the thing about the oil from Venezuela is it's a very heavy oil. It's difficult to refine. You do need probably U.S. corporations involved in it. But I'm not sure the U.S. corporations are that interested in getting caught up in the middle of a gunfight between China and the U.S. So there are all these unanswered questions about what is behind this. The main thing I would say is that Trump is now looking at the upcoming midterm elections. His base is splitting, and it's splitting over the Zionism question, the genocide question, the Charlie Kirk question, the Candace Owen and Tucker Carlson break with the idea that Trump is not really America first. So he's trying to show that he is going to adhere to this idea of making the United States the most powerful force on the planet. Now, what does that do for the developing sector? It confronts them with the reality, which is that what is going to happen is what the United States wants to happen. And this was what Nebenza, who's the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, what he had to say is very interesting. He said that you're now creating a situation where based on what the U.S. did in Venezuela, Nebenza said, the bell now tolls across the region for all member states. And he added that the U.S. cannot be the supreme judge of which governments are allowed to exist, and irrespective of international law. Now, that statement was endorsed by many of the global South countries. So, it's not a slam dunk the way it seemed when Trump held this press conference. where he said, no one is ever again going to question American dominance in the Western Hemisphere. And what Rubio said is, we're not going to allow the oil industry in Venezuela to be controlled by adversaries of the United States. Now, how does the United States make that determination? And, they're actually inverting the idea of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was to guarantee the sovereignty of Latin American countries from encroachment from Europe. Now what they're saying is countries cannot choose to have trade partners or relations unless they're approved by the United States. So it's a perversion of the idea of the Monroe Doctrine. But no one's pointing that out, or what they now call the Monroe Doctrine.
Well, you pointed it out here on this show 2 weeks ago, that that is exactly the perversion of the Monroe Doctrine that is being sold. And, that's part of the psyop, I believe, to make people forget that, America was really there to protect the sovereignty of these smaller countries and not to own them. But
you know who wrote the Monroe Doctrine?
Tell me.
The Secretary of State for Monroe was John Quincy Adams.
Okay, yeah.
And he drafted the Monroe Doctrine as a proud supporter of the United States as the anti-colonial force in the world. And the idea was that the United States would stand to protect the nations of Latin America from intrusion by the French, the Spanish, and the British and the Portuguese. And that was the whole idea behind it, to give these nations an opportunity to develop their economies in conjunction with whomever they like. And instead, you now have Trump dictating who these countries can work with. And I'm not sure, as I said, John, I haven't figured out yet exactly what Trump thinks he's doing. I think he's being poorly briefed by the CIA. The fact that John Bolton and Pompeo were praising what he just did tells you something about the shift that's underway. Now, what's going to happen with Tucker Carlson and the Tom Massey, the Kentucky congressman, Marjorie Taylor Greene? There's been a shift in U.S. politics in the last year, largely in response to the U.S. continuing to support Netanyahu's imperial policy. And it remains to be seen where MAGA members stand on this. Now, initially, the Republicans formed circled the wagons around Trump to support him, because most of the Republicans are still war hawks. They're happy to spend money on fighting. But we'll see how long that lasts, and especially if Americans, since we don't know what for sure that this is the mission accomplished. I just wrote something this morning called Venezuela Mission Accomplished, and referred back to George W. Bush less than 2 months after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, standing on the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier, announcing the mission is accomplished and it's over. And 8 years later, the war continued in Iraq, and we still have troops in Iraq. So is it really the case that the Venezuelan military has stepped back and said, we'll allow you to plunder our country? We don't know.
Well, you mentioned MAGA, and it's interesting and perhaps meaningful that we're having this discussion on January 6th. This is the anniversary of the so-called insurrection. However, the idea of it being an insurrection is fixed in the minds of probably half of the population of this country, at least, and that it was the opposite is fixed in the minds of certainly all the MAGA people, as well as people like Thomas Massey and MTG, as you mentioned. And so there's Trump, who is now striding those two positions, wants to keep his MAGA people, but at the same time, it looks like he's not uh, not singing the song of "Make America Great Again," and in fact is what it looks to me like he is bowing to other pressure. Like you said, he folded on the CIA 3 times. You identified. It's also, I think, the CIA, I'm sure, is representing higher powers like the great banks and the great oil companies and the great multinationals and the oligarchy that stands behind all this. So is he fighting and doing the best he can, and taking his licks, but keeping his eye on the goal of making America great again, or is he already compromised? Or sadly, he was probably compromised all along, and we knew this would fold up. And but see, I have great sympathy for the MAGA people because I see such sincerity there. I see people who really truly want that American dream for their children and grandchildren, and to keep it going for the future, and to see them cast aside by what looks more and more to me like a uniparty in favor of invasions that please people like Lindsey Graham, who couldn't stop smiling. Um, you know, I told Marcia, my wife, the other day, I said, this is like the new Knights of the Golden Circle coming back, Uh, I mean, is it the new Knights of the Golden Circle when you see they take Venezuela, now they're going to take Cuba, they're looking at Mexico kind of hard, and is it all just theater that the world is becoming sewn together at a rate that none of us can stop? Okay, I'll shut up.
Well, no, these are important questions. Let me throw out a few more. It's being said that Miller's, I think it's Stephen Miller, who's one of the real rabble rousers inside the Trump administration, that he's saying that this is really about Dominion voting machines.
Okay.
And that they're going in to grab the voting machines. That the story is that the Venezuelans developed for the Democratic Party to use against Trump. Now, we haven't heard anything about Dominion for quite a while, have we?
I think I heard that they were closed out. They folded up. Is what I heard.
Yeah, they did, but the story is still there that they were the ones who were involved in stealing the 2020 election.
Yeah, a
with
big
the 2026, with the 2026 election coming up, and the difficulty that the Republicans are going to have unless the economy turns around. Maybe this is part of the reality, or maybe it's just part of the theater. Now, then you have the whole question of the Florida mafia. Susie Wiles, for example, who did this unbelievable interview with I think it was the Atlantic, where she talked about how she disagrees with Trump on some things and he's got an ego problem. And she laid out a whole bunch of things that really showed that she didn't seem to be so loyal to Trump. And then she was backpedaling like crazy. But she's tied into the Rubio machine. And if there's someone who's corrupt in this group, it's Marco Rubio. And he represents a connection to the old Bush war machine and the McCain war machine. And he's now being called the Viceroy of Venezuela. But look what he controls. He's the Secretary of State. He's the National Security Advisor. He's in charge of USAID, which is the regime change operation of the U.S. government. And now he's in charge of Venezuela. Now, is he being set up to fail, or is he being set up to replace J.D. Vance as the 2028 presidential candidate representing Trump. Now, in that context, I found it very interesting that over the weekend, there was an attempted break-in at J.D. Vance's house in Ohio. And the police are tracking down, they actually have the suspect in that case. But, if it's going to be Vance versus Rubio, Vance is much more along the lines, at least in public, of opposing this kind of U.S. involvement in military action. So, that's why I say there's so many questions. What we're doing, there are two things we're doing.
That's a great point. I just wanted to stop you just long enough to say wow, that makes so much sense, because J.D. Vance is talking like, a liberty-loving American, mom and apple pie, and we're gonna do the right thing. But that's not in the cards. And Rubio, of course. May I make another point?
Sure.
That
your show, John.
Well, no, I just wanted to not pass this by. Was that when you mentioned, and I had not known it, that Rubio comes out of the Cuban revolutionary movement that existed in the early they that was, one of the big problems for JFK, and that they will feel betrayed by JFK. And so for those of us that are thinking we're going to get all of the JFK stuff dumped out this year, it's pretty obvious that Rubio would be a break on that, to say, no, because if all of that stuff comes out, then the conspiracy is going to come out, and clearly any involvement of the Cuban revolutionaries is going to pull a string that's going to lead to everything. So I just wanted to make that point, because I'm saddened to think that we've got Trump, his hands tied. He probably would like to dump all of this JFK stuff out. At least that's what MAGA people think.
Well, it goes deeper than that, because Rubio is too young to have been involved with the networks in the actual Bay of Pigs. But every year for the last 10 years, he's been a speaker at the Bay of Pigs Veterans Dinner.
Mm-hmm.
So he's connected to them. And of course, who were they? They were the people picked up by the CIA. And as you point out, some of them are suspected of having played a role in the Kennedy assassination. The networks of Hunt and McCord and others, who are part of the overall group of suspects in the Dallas murder of John F. Kennedy. But then let's go deeper. Iran-Contra. The Iran-Contra, if this is seriously meant as an anti-drug operation, why are some of the people involved the ones who are part of the Contras, which was a drug network that brought drugs into the United States in the 1980s to sell them to especially poor Black Americans as crack cocaine, as pointed out by the San Jose Mercury News special series on it. This was a network that was tied to Richard Secord and Southern Air Transport, which we found out about when Eugene Hassenfuss was shot down over Nicaragua in I think, 1986. And the Iran-Contra story was never fully told. But what was the Iran side of it? The U.S. was going through British arms traffickers like Adnan Khashoggi, who used the Bank for Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, to launder the money, the drug money and the arms money, to then give money to Israel to buy U.S. weapons that Israel gave to Iran. That's the whole story of Iran-Contra. Now, what's come out recently on this? One of the people involved in that was none other than Jeffrey Epstein.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, again, it comes back to these circles of who's controlling who, who's making the policy, who's doing the cover up. And so when you look at the emergence of Rubio as a key player in the Trump administration, you're right back to the pre-2016 election campaign when Trump leveled the Bush machine. He destroyed Jeb Bush. He destroyed Rubio. He talked to him about him as little Marco. And also Ted Cruz. Remember, Cruz ran against Trump in 2016, and Trump had to destroy him. And who was the person who was running Cruz's campaign? Steve Bannon. So what you see, and that was Bannon before he jumped on the bandwagon and became part of the Trump administration, during which he turned on Roger Stone and worked with the feds to get rid of Stone. So you have this gang of, I would say, at least treacherous individuals, Rubio and so on. And they were working with these networks that included top people in the Justice Department. And the last point on this is that Epstein, using money from Les Wexner, the Victoria's Secret guy, bought Southern Air Transport Airlines from the CIA. And he put them through bankruptcy 2 days before the Justice Department released their report on Iran-Contra. So the cover-up, the overall mechanisms, all of these things were there. How much of this comes out in the press? How come there's nothing? It's very difficult to find anything on Marco Rubio. How he went from being destroyed by Trump in 2016 to being part of the neocons who were against Trump in his first term, to now be one of the controlling figures in the Trump administration. Now, I have to say, in the interest of full disclosure, some of my contacts and friends tell me that Trump is involved in smoking out the networks in the intelligence community that are tied to the British and are against him. If so, you have to ask the question of how effective is it to rely on them to run operations if you're eventually planning on exposing them. It could be. As I've often said, John, I think I've told you, I don't believe in Trumpology. I don't think we can try and figure out what's going on in his mind, because I'm not sure he knows what's going on from 1 minute to the next. And some people say that's his great strength. He can dissemble and confuse. Others say it's his corruption. I don't know. I tend to focus on the question of what's necessary to avoid World War III. And that's the one area where I have some respect for Trump, his attempt to normalize relations with Russia. But that was badly set back, at least it seems to have been set back, by his attempt to refute the Russians' evidence that the Ukrainians and probably the CIA were involved in targeting Putin's summer home.
It sounds like a spy war going on in the back rooms of the world. That Trump. If you look, legally, the president gets to say what the CIA does. I mean, it's just that's the way it is. And if there are CIA officers that don't agree with Trump, are they powerful enough to stonewall Trump's agenda? Are they, or has Trump been able to edge them out? And it sounds like he's kind of, if that's what he's doing, he's stuck in the middle of that battle right now, and because he has to give them, in order for him to maintain his ability to negotiate with Putin, he's got to give them cover for that. If he didn't give them cover, then Putin could just, break off all negotiations on the basis of an attempt on his life or his family's life. So he's trying to get it to just blow over, I think.
Well, remember what Chuck Schumer said about the Trump's relationship with the CIA. If they come after you, they'll get you 6 ways from Sunday. Now, let me throw in one other independent variable that may be involved in this question of the oil, which is if Trump made a deal with Bibi Netanyahu, that Netanyahu can go ahead and strike Iran again, and the U.S. will back them. There's fear that if there is a new assault against the Iranians, which could include a similar kind of thing to the kidnapping of Maduro, Iran could shut down the Straits of Hormuz, through which a huge amount of oil that's needed in Europe and elsewhere goes through. If they did that, wouldn't it be wonderful to have as a backup the oil reserves of Venezuela? So, it really is, John, like a very convoluted and complicated spy story, a novel. In fact, if I had the time, maybe I'd write a novel about
it. Everybody's improvising as they go along. I have to mention, I saw just right before the show somebody doing a little YouTube clip wearing an Aleister Crowley hat, a triangle hat with the thing on it and all. And I'm thinking, do what thou wilt. The law of Philemia, or whatever he calls this religion, is do what thou wilt. And I'm thinking that's what Trump's doing. He's like, you know what? Nobody else is going to do it. I'm going to do it. And, we can call it Don Monroe doctrine. But it is a powerful assertion of leadership to take such a step. And the world is saying, no, you're not going to get away with it. But on the other hand, he has Space Force, he has cyber warfare, he has all kinds of assets that if they are loyal to him, like I think he was hinting, he said, hey, those Russian aircraft batteries didn't do too well, did they? Well, I think that he's saying he shut them down electronically or something like that.
or others are saying that he actually had a deal with Putin.
What deal? A deal with Putin to what?
That if Putin didn't protest the kidnapping of Maduro, Trump would continue to go after Zelensky. That's one of the other stories out there.
I like that one. I like that one. Interesting.
Now, let me throw in one more factor.
Sure.
Which is ongoing right now. The crash of Bitcoin. After Trump and his Commerce Secretary and his sons are pushing Bitcoin as the solution to the debt crisis, Bitcoin just went right through the floor in the last 2 weeks.
Oh.
And the Federal Reserve pumped $70 billion of quantitative loosening of money into the system to protect some of the assets that are about to be lost. Now, if that continues, it will grow much larger. That is the losses. And then you superimpose that on the attempt to have a military buildup with no income coming in. There was another report that came out that said that all the talk about the money that's coming in from the tariffs, there's been very little collected. And there's been very little new credit for the industries that Lutnick and others say they're going to rebuild based on the tariffs. So what happens if you go into a midterm election where increasing numbers of people who are your base, that Trump did appeal to the blue collar workers who were previously Democrats, who bought his campaign in 16 and then again in 2024. What happens when they can't put food on the table, when they can't keep the roof over their head, when they have to choose between going to the doctor and paying the gardener or paying for the water bill? What happens in that? That's how presidencies are lost. And in 2026, the midterm election will determine whether Trump becomes a lame duck president as of November 2026. So, this may also explain why he's trying to show how tough he is. And this gets back to the Ukraine war. What happens if the Ukraine army collapses, which it's doing? It's collapsing day by day. What happens? Will Trump stay back and say that was Biden's doing? Don't blame me. Or will the Democrats try and pin it on Trump? And will some Republicans, some MAGA Republicans, pin it on Trump? What happens then with the potential to lose the extremely narrow margin that the Republicans have in the House and the Senate? So this is a moment of incredible drama. That's why I say it really could be a brilliant movie, but I'm not sure we have good enough writers to bring the whole story out on the screen.
If Trump had better writers, he wouldn't be losing the midterms.
No, of course not.
I mean,
but you see, this is where one of the other lines about Trump is that he's preparing to move against the Federal Reserve. Now, if he did that today, what would happen with the outstanding debt? You'd have a collapse of the US bond market. The dollar would collapse. So he can't move against the Federal Reserve. He can talk against it, but he just stood by and let the Federal Reserve pump $70 billion into the money supply last week. To do what? To back up Bitcoin and artificial intelligence. Who runs artificial intelligence and Bitcoin? It's Silicon Valley, which sometimes is Republican, sometimes it's Democrat, but basically it's a bipartisan grouping that is tied to the military-industrial complex. So once again, we see Trump acting to defend those interests that he says he's opposing. Now, does he have some grand plot to pull them into basically then sabotage them, cut their throats? Well, that's what you hear from some of his supporters. If it is, it's the most clever diabolical plot I've ever seen.
It's really weird to just see him let the Democrats prevail in the media so strongly that I would be surprised if he doesn't lose the House and probably the Senate. Well, the Ukraine war just goes on, and my cynical self is saying, well, that's the military-industrial complex, just business as usual. Gotta make more artillery shells because they all used them up, and so and make sure and get your 10%. That cynicism, goes along with the idea of one world government, of trying to make the world amenable to one government across the entire world. And MAGA people are thinking, Trump is going to save us from that. We're going to, and the Trump's vision is, to take the hemisphere, to take Greenland, because obviously we need Greenland because we need that Arctic territory to grab our share of the oil and other assets.
The route to the Arctic. Yeah, that's what it's. Yeah,
that's
and
what
he's talking about Russian and Chinese ships surrounding Greenland.
But it also goes along with 1984, and then of course the Musk family's tradition of favoring a technate. So you see the maps of these things, and you say, wow. Trump's just going to play into that three world powers scenario that Aldous Huxley told us about. It's going to be, America, and it's going to be Russia, and it's going to be China, and they're all going to have their spheres of influence. But there's always going to be border wars going on, and I love the way that he explained why there's always going to be border wars going on. It's to burn up the excess profits that the people would usually would make in order to improve their lives, to make sure that they never improve their lives by taking the money that they could have kept and sending it into some war that they have to sell, through the media, which you referred to earlier. Is why doesn't the media talk about anything? And I guess the answer is pretty obvious. So go ahead.
Well, let me just tout my own work for a moment as a way of unraveling the whole thing. You saw the report I did on who is the real Epstein.
Yes.
And it gets at this question of the corruption in the financial system that was necessary to move the United States from an economy based on physical economic production, real wealth creation, which is where we were headed after World War II. FDR's idea was turn the military machine, the tanks and so on, into tractors and high-speed rail and so on. Eisenhower tried to do some of that, but he was sabotaged by the Dulles brothers and others. And then Kennedy, when he tried to do it, he was killed. Now, if you look at what Epstein represents, not as a controlling genius, but as a figure who is there constantly. I think someone referred to him as the the character, the Forrest Gump, who kept showing up at important moments in history. Well, he's there in all of these moments because he's part of the operation that's run from the top to pull together organized crime, the corruption of the intelligence community. Look, he worked with the CIA, MI6, and the Mossad. He worked with the junk bond mafia of Michael Milken, which included organized crime, the Anti-Defamation League. It also included a role that he played with the Silicon Valley at the end. His last act was to work with Peter Thiel and Palantir, the so-called private sector that's part of the new military-industrial complex. So if you pull that string, who is pushing him? Who is protecting him? Who is defending him? It wasn't that he was blackmailing everybody using sex. I mean, this is business as usual for these guys, using people, whether they're underage or not. No, it's much more who is using Epstein as a front man to pull these different things together. And that's where you can begin to find something that I really think is necessary. Who was running the operation against Lyndon LaRouche? Because Lyndon LaRouche identified this network when we produced the book Dope Incorporated. And we showed how the British used their offshore islands, their tax havens, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, Marine Midland Bank, JP Morgan Chase, Deutsche Bank, the insurance companies, how all of these were part of the corporate cartels that were building a new fascist world order. And it's not Klaus Schwab. He was an Epstein type. He was an operative for these City of London interests. Now, these are the people who deployed against LaRouche. And I'm particularly honed in on this because I mentioned earlier the Southern Air Transport thing. Epstein, when he was first let loose by Bear Stearns, and there's a whole question of what did he do that was wrong that got him fired from Bear Stearns, or did he just leave? He hooked up with a guy named J. Stanley Pottinger. Now, who is Pottinger? You probably know Pottinger or know of him. He was a top operative in the Justice Department. And he was one of the people who protected the Iran-Contra networks. But at the same time, he was working with Epstein to figure out ways to launder the money that went to the Iran-Contra operation so that no one could trace it. Now, if you pull on that string, what you find is that Pottinger was one of the people who worked with Kissinger and William Webster to target Lyndon LaRouche. Why? Because LaRouche's vision in the middle of the 1980s was essentially what's now the BRICS. Pull together the strongest independent nations, including Russia, China, Brazil, India, because they're powerful enough to stand up against the City of London. Pull that together and have a cooperation to develop global infrastructure and to give poor countries that have raw material wealth the capability to use their own raw material wealth for their people as opposed to for the cartel. It was LaRouche's vision in the 70s even. And so the attack on LaRouche was done by the very same people who protected Epstein and who are protecting this scummy element in the Justice Department, the intelligence community, State Department, and so on.
May I say Bill Barr?
Of course. Yeah. And his father, Donald Barr, who was an OSS guy, who was the one who brought Epstein into the network that ended up with him at Bear Stearns. And what was Bear Stearns? It was one of these private financial firms that was constantly getting fined for illegal monetary transactions. So, and then who protected the Epstein operation? Members of the U.S. attorneys' offices. So the whole network could be opened up and exposed. And I'm a little angry that the work that I did on telling the story has been eclipsed by DropSite. Now, DropSite's done some good stuff. Ryan,
I'm not familiar. Is that a website?
It's a website, and if you go to DropSite, you'll see that they're the ones who poured through the Epstein emails, and they've done a lot of good expose, but they miss the bigger question, which is the global reset financially that's gone on repeatedly since 1971. And that's the key to LaRouche, that he was on that from the very beginning. And unless you go after the British networks, because they're the ones who could do that, unless you trace through the interrelationship between arms trafficking, drug trafficking, money laundering, and so on, unless you go after that, you miss the big picture. And I'm just going to promote my article again. People should read it. I think you posted it on your website, didn't you?
Well, actually, my website hasn't been very up to date, so no, I didn't post it there, but I did post it after the show about a month ago. But send me the link again, and I'll post it.
Okay, it's a 2-part series on who is the real Jeffrey Epstein, and
it's
supposed to want to get an insight into lifting the lid off the sewer. That's a good place to start.
Harley, someone in the comments is mentioning he brought up Lyndon LaRouche the other night, and the response is, "You're in a cult." Well, this business of putting a big poison sign on anything that LaRouche has done or said has been very, very effective, I must say, and for a reason that they put so much trouble into charging him with a crime and locking him up. And the reason that I would offer is that if you can get past the first layer of slime that they throw at him and at all of the folks that you've worked with over so many years, you'll find a treasure trove of information that can help you understand what's happening in the world.
That's getting out there. If you look at what's going on in Africa, I had a long talk last night with a woman who now lives in London, but she's very connected to the French West African movement that kicked the French out and that's moving towards setting up a commonwealth. They're using LaRouche's writings about the American system.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a part of Africa that has raw materials out the wazoo. So I think we're seeing a shift internationally that's not being caught up with yet in the United States, because people are still gullible enough to fall for the arm of the military industrial complex in the media.
I can't tell you how many instances of me, because I do get a lot of books. Okay, that's my thing. And when I get a new book that tells all about the real history of the Second World War, or the real history of that and all, there's stuff in there that I already knew because I've studied EIR material, and they don't credit you at all. I think that everybody thinks that you guys are toxic, but you're not. You've got a treasure of work behind you, and I'm sure a lot of great work ahead of you. Harley,
Certainly hope so.
thanks so much for being with me again. It's really an honor and a pleasure. Thank you, Harley.
See you in 2 weeks.
All right, everybody. Have a great afternoon. I will see you on Thursday with McDuff's Minefields. Bye now.